welcome back to Insane in the Endgame. I am National Master Caleb Denby, filling in for our Grandmaster in Residence tonight. And it's a very special topic. So as I was talking to the in-person audience here, a lot of people know Capablanca as the great Endgame maestro. But tonight I want to talk about one of his predecessors, not by long, but I guess technically a predecessor, Akiba Rubinstein, who was very talented in Rook endgames, so the story goes. So to start off tonight, I want to go over a game between Spielmann and Rubinstein that happened back in 1909. And this is potentially one of the more famous Rook endgames in existence. I believe the story goes that after the game, Spielmann told Rubinstein that if he were alive in the Middle Ages, he would be burned at the stake because what he does in Rook endgames can only be called witchcraft. Now, I'm misquoting a little bit of paraphrasing, but let's see how magical Rubinstein actually is. So of course, this is an endgame class. I don't care about any of the chess game that happens until we get to this endgame. Okay, so still don't care. And I'm going to wait for the bishops to be traded. And okay, I sort of spoiled my first question already, but that's okay. Here we are in this Rook endgame. So part of what I want to talk about tonight is the balance between good calculation and what we call endgame knowledge, or principles, the theoretical stuff that you're just supposed to know. Because I think a lot of people assume that the endgame is all about knowledge. Whoever knows the most principles, whoever has the most knowledge about the endgame is going to be better. But my argument has always been that endgames are first and foremost, kind of like all chess, about calculating. With so few pieces on the board, you can calculate to pretty great depths. You can see really far into the position, see what's going on. And whoever calculates better can make better decisions. So we're going to see how that plays into the endgame we have here. But my first question for you guys is, White has just played Rook 1 to C2. In taking stock of the position, we see that Black has just 2 pawn islands to White's 4. And that plays into endgame knowledge a little bit. It's better to have your pawns grouped together because they're able to defend each other. You see the F pawn defends the G pawn. If the F pawn was weak, we could move it and it'd be defended by the G pawn. Whereas White's pawns are all by their lonesome, unable to defend each other. And so theoretically, Black might be a little bit better in the endgame because these pawns are going to be a little bit weaker. But our first decision is what to do in this position. White just played Rook 1 C2, defending against the threat of Rook F2, and we are faced with a big decision. We could play Rook takes C2, trading down. We could take the free pawn on A3, or we could play something else. I don't know, maybe like Rook B2, Rook A1, and those are all the moves that don't hang a rook. So my question to you guys is, which of these moves seems the most appealing to you, and why? Let's talk about it. And hello to everyone in the Twitch chat, or not Twitch, we're on YouTube tonight, everyone in the YouTube chat. Can never get enough Rook endgames, I agree. So any thoughts? Trade. So why trade over maybe the more natural taking the pawn on A3?
Because of what you said earlier about the positions of your pawns?
What I said about what?
About the position of your pawns, like you kind of want to trade material down just because you have the advantage right now?
Yeah, kind of. There's something more direct that I want to talk about than, trading down is fine for Black. We're still going to be better because of our pawn structure. But, keeping pieces on the board should still be fine as well. Like, there's no reason why trading down would increase that advantage.
Might it be better because it brings the rook off of the, the 7th rank and allows your king to move towards the center?
Yeah, so that's closer to the truth. But the big thing I wanted to point out is it's all about calculating. Those principles are useful. Having an active rook on the 7th is something we want to get rid of. That's a good principle. Rooks on the 7th are powerful. But at the end, it comes down to chess moves. And so the reason why I don't like rook takes a3 is because of very direct, very concrete moves for white here. So there's actually a direct idea that I want to avoid as black here. Yeah, Brian?
Rook d7 and then other rook to c7.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So rook d7 pressures the d6 pawn. If you play a slower move like rook b6, you're going to get met with rook c to c7. And you can defend your f pawn over here, but okay, actually, hold on. I just blundered mate in 1. Not so good.
But you were defending the pawn.
Yeah, I did defend the pawn. That's a good point. So that goes to show, black already has pretty serious problems. But let's say we play a slightly better move, like I don't know. It's hard to suggest many moves here. Something like rook f3. First of all, this pawn's already falling. Second of all, king g2, and these ideas are still going to be in the position. And so this is why I'd rather take on c2 than play rook takes a3. Because rook takes a3, white has very direct ideas that give black concrete problems. And that's the point I was trying to make earlier. Following principles like activating the king, keeping your opponent's pieces passive, they can lead you to the right moves, but that's not the end of the story. You have to calculate. You have to say, well, what is the problem with taking an extra pawn? And once you find stuff like rook d7, then you see, okay, so rook takes a3. These moves are the reason why I don't want to go for that. So we get rook takes c2 in the game, and that's the best move. Now rook takes c2. And black's next move is actually very, very important. So I want to take a moment here and look at some of the options. So I think someone in the audience mentioned bringing the king out. So that's one option. What are some other candidate moves or ideas here?
Moving the rook to b3 to keep the king, white king in play, or in place.
Yeah, so activating the rook. Rook b3 was your specific idea. Let me get rid of some of those arrows. With the idea of course, attacking the a pawn and cutting the king off on the third rank. Any other ideas?
Possibly rook a8 and then to a4 to attack both pawns, potentially attack them.
Yeah, so these are our three big ideas, I think. Bringing the king in, king e7, or activating our rook somehow. And our two big ideas for that were either rook b3 or rook to a8. So how do we decide between these ideas? And I'll give you a hint. It's about calculation. So you want to calculate a little bit here. That's what endgames are about. Yes, we know the principles. That's how we got our candidate moves. We want to activate our rook and activate our king. But the question is, what's the best way to play? And you find that through calculation. So, for example, what's white's response to rook b3? What's white's response to rook a8? And what is white doing against king e7 as well? And if we analyze those a little bit further, that's how we arrive at the truth of the matter. So I think we can eliminate one of these moves without too much controversy here. So which one of these seems like the least likely to be?
Probably like the king move, I think.
Yeah, so why is the king move maybe not ideal?
Because I imagine you could just kind of like probably check the king if you wanted to.
Yeah, it's going to allow white to get active right away. We're going to get this rook back here on the 7th, and it's going to be pressuring the pawns. Can also activate a rook like this, support our a pawn, pressure along the 7th rank, and I have a hard time believing that white is going to be in too much danger here. There's another idea that white can play against king e7 as well, but that will maybe lead us to why the other move is also not as good. So king e7 gives white too many options to be active. We want to force our opponent into passivity. We want to make his pieces passive and defending while we can activate.
So then would the A move be better so that he also still can't check?
So I'm going to say that, that's not going to be the reason to pick Rook A8 over Rook B3, if that is what you want to do. Because, okay, I mean, for example, if Rook B3, Rook A8 check, Rook C8 check and Rook A8, I think white is pretty immediately losing some pawns here. Like the D4 pawn is weak. If you try to defend it like this, I can activate my king. And I think you're just losing the D pawn. So yeah, Rook C8 is not going to be the problem with any of our lines. So there's a very famous rule in Rook endgames. It's a very famous rule, and it has to do with passed pawns. So where do rooks belong with passed pawns? Yeah, rooks belong behind passed pawns. And that's going to be the reason why one of these moves is better than the other. I also wanted to point this out in the event of King E7 as well. It might seem like a move like Rook A2 is a little beside the point. We're activating our king, we're coming into the center, why Rook A2? But even here, I think this is going to give black some problems if black is still trying to win the game. I mean, this pawn is coming up the board. We have to blockade it eventually. And then while black is coming over to capture this guy, we might find ourselves unable to get a winning position here. If we defend this, I come back, you push, I'm invading. And you can never really take this pawn without losing d6. And then this endgame should be a draw. We have 2 pawns against 3. Even though our pawns are split, black has a lot of trouble winning this game. Should just be a technical draw. So it's a very important idea for white to be able to go Rook A2 and push the A pawn down the board, because it's going to distract the black pieces over. Even in the event that we pick up the D pawn, it might not be enough to win the game. So with that information in mind, with this very clear plan for white, which of these moves is going to be better, Rook B3 or Rook A8? Yeah, so why is this better against something like Rook A2? Yeah, Brian?
Because we could play Rook A4 and Rook A8.
That's exactly right. Now we have better than going King E7 and trying to win in the center. We can go Rook A4 and stop this pawn all the way back here on A3. And with this pawn on A3, obviously, white's going to have a tougher time distracting our pieces away. We're going to be able to maybe take the D pawn and start pushing ourselves. So Rook A8 is much, much better than Rook B3. It's against Rook B3 again. Rook A2 is going to be a big problem. You can maybe go like Rook D3, try to win this pawn. But again, you're just going to be way too slow in the long run. You can blockade. You're not losing by any means. But, I mean, even like Rook A6 here, we activate the king, and we're going to get that drawn endgame. OK, so first big decision here. Rook A8 is a very, very important move. Now, in the game, Spielmann chooses not to go Rook A2 and instead plays the move Rook C3, trying to defend from the side. And now Rook A4. Still, this is a great move, pressuring both pawns and forcing this rook to be even more passive than before. Now, finally, once we've forced this rook to be passive, what's the next step for black? Yeah, just King E7, bring the king into the game. We get King G3 by white, King E6, King F3, and I'm going to cheat a little bit. OK, one more move, King D5 puts pressure on the D pawn. White steps back with King to E2. Now, again, endgames are all about calculation. So both players had to decide what's happening after rook takes D4. And what's happening is I think this should just be a draw. A4. And I don't think this is what black wants to be going for. I do think the evaluation is a draw, but if anything, it's going to be black who's in trouble here with these pawns. Everybody loves a good old-fashioned pawn race. So once again, calculation very important. Showing that rook takes d4 is not going to be enough to win for black. So we have achieved two of our big goals. We activated our king, we activated our rook. We've kept the white rook passive back here on d3. So having achieved all that, what else can black do here to try and continue putting the pressure on?
Push the pawn.
The kingside pawns?
Yes.
Okay, so how do you want to do that? What's our long-term plan aside from, in specific moves? What are we going for?
I've moved the F pawn 2 squares.
You want to go to f5,
Yes.
and then like long-term, like what are you hoping to do? Like what's your destination for this f pawn?
Actually, to get one of the pawns on the B file passed.
G5.
Yeah. So okay.
Sorry,
Trying to make a passed pawn. The issue here is I'm not so sure you can even do that. Like, let's say I pass forever. Like, how do you make a passed pawn here? Yeah. You get g5, you get g4, I take it. And still no passed pawns. The f pawn still blockades. So it's not quite that simple for black. You can't really make a passed pawn with this 3 versus 2 on the king side. You could, but then if your king leaves sort of this attacking position, well, actually maybe you just can't, because like where does your king go? If your king's in front of the pawns, you might get checked around. And I think our king is well placed in the center of the board. Maybe someday it'll come to the king's side, but maybe it'll also come to the queen's side. So it's nice and flexible here. Well, that's the thing. I'm not saying it's not a pawn move, but our idea is not so much to try to make a passed pawn on the king's side, but we can actually improve our structure here a little bit. Yeah, Brian?
Well, I was wondering, G5 followed by F5 just to control all those squares.
Yeah. So G5 is actually the great move that Rubinstein starts with here. And this move is really important. It keeps both of these pawns sort of at bay, and it grabs a little bit of extra space for black. On top of that, black might not actually want to play this move f5. It's a little bit weakening. It's going to make it a little bit harder to keep track of all the pawns. But simply f6, and black's pawns on the king side are going to be very, very solid. And we'll see why that's so important in a little bit. But for now, g5 is a great start. It keeps these pawns at bay. It grabs a little bit of extra space on the king side. And it's going to make it easier to target these weaknesses, right? Because in this position, if you imagine somehow the h-pawn gets attacked, maybe it moves up to h4, and you have to chase it down a little bit further. In fact, g5 is so powerful that white should probably play a different move here. White should probably actually be playing h4. You want to keep the g pawns at bay as white, just as black wants to keep your h and f pawns where they are. So something like h4 would stop these pawns in their tracks and make it a little bit harder for black to get a nice solid structure. So in the game, king e2, maybe a mistake by white. We get g5 by Rubinstein, rook b3. And this move is, again, trying to escape from being so passive. White is okay in a lot of positions with parting with this d-pawn, as long as he can get active. Something like rook b7, even giving up this pawn, and going for endgames like this. I think this one should just be a draw as well, if I'm not mistaken. Don't think I'm mistaken. Okay. Not to mention, in this event, you would have to calculate this as well. But I think rook b7 is good enough here. And same thing with something like this, something like rook b7. And then against rook f4, I think white has an important resource here. Any ideas? What was that? Yeah, I was thinking this move a4. And the point now is that we want to take this pawn with the rook. But now, again, we're going to be able to come over and start taking your pawns on the king side. What are we talking about? Oh, rook d3. Okay, that's maybe the simplest. We get the same endgame that we were looking at earlier. Although, yeah, if anything, this is a better version for white, which might mean black is in trouble, but probably not with all these pawns. Okay, so rook b3, and yeah, rook d3 is the simplest. So we get f6. Again, we're just solidifying our structure over here on the king side. Now, king to e3. Again, I don't think black wants to be playing something like f5. f5 is really only serving to make both of these pawns weaker than with this pawn on f6. So with that in mind, we've kind of improved our king to the maximum. It's great on d5. It seems like our rook is very well positioned as well. Again, rook takes d4 is met with rook d3. So what do we do now? Seems like we ran out of improving moves. So what's the plan? What's the plan now? It's not so easy, this board game. I'm going to cheat to make sure I know where we are. Okay. I do know where we are. Sometimes these endgames, they shuffle around. It's easy to lose track.
So like, are you trying to avoid him from going to b7?
Yeah, so we've kind of successfully avoided that by having our rook on a4. For example, I mean, rook b7 was playable last turn, but you don't really want to give up these pawns in particular, I think. Although, okay, I should probably, no. I do want to take this one instead. If you attack my guy, I'm able to defend it. And I think this endgame should be winning. If anything, I'm putting my rook on f4 and taking your d pawn. And 2 pawns to the good is good enough. So we have prevented rook b7 for the moment. We need some way to improve our position further. All right, the YouTube chat wants to try and put white into some kind of zugzwang, but they're not sure how. Somebody suggested rook a5, but I mean, in this position, I can just repeat something like rook c3 with the idea of rook b3, with the idea of rook c3. Very strong.
Sorry, did you already talk about king c4?
I did not. So what's the story? King c4. Why does it seem good?
Comes with tempo of the rook and
Yeah, kind of like.
Okay, it comes with tempo, so white plays rook d3.
uh-huh.
What are we achieving?
Maybe getting d5.
Okay, d5, and let's say white continues to pass, king d2. Do we have a plan for improvement? it's a little ambitious to play the full ring around the rosy, but no, you guys are right. This does improve our position. And the reason why is because, number one, our pawn is sort of one step closer to being relevant, one step closer to queening. Number two, we're also taking away a lot of squares from this rook. We're no longer really worried about these lines. So someone in the audience correctly pointed out this is nice because the rook is never really coming active anymore. And we're also taking away just all these squares. So white just might find himself short on moves pretty soon here. So we do have a really nice active plan in this position. And then I have a funny story as well. So someone in the chat asks, won't our king get harassed on the c4 square? And the answer is pretty much just no. You can't ever really attack this king without losing your d pawn.
We could bring the rook back to a8 and threaten to go h8 and, give it more options like that.
Yeah, I love it. So now that our king is so actively placed on c4, up to this point, our rook has been serving a really, really important purpose on the a4 square. It's been stopping white's passed a pawn from advancing any further and having any chance of being relevant. But as you may know, rooks are more powerful pieces than kings. So we would much rather have our king serving this purpose of stopping the a pawn than our rook, because the rook's more mobile, has a better shot at attacking white's pawns. And so this kind of changing of the guard is very important. And that's another reason why king c4 is so good. It frees up our rook to come over here with rook a8. And now moves like a4 are not really, okay, well, I'm sorry. Let's say king c2. I play like this move or something. a4 is still not going to be super important because our king can quite easily stop this pawn. So rook a8 played in the game, and this is a very good way to put on some pressure to white's position. Now, white plays the move king to c2, and my funny story is approaching here. So chat room, I'm going to lead you down the red herring. In the game, Rubinstein came up with a very, very creative idea, almost too creative, to put white into Zugzwang. And for years, annotators of chess games were praising Rubinstein for this move. Exclamation points everywhere. So good. Putting white into Zugzwang. But I have something they didn't have, which is, something like a 3,600 level player in my corner. 3,500. I don't know what Stockfish is rated these days, but it's pretty good.
Purely because you said that it has an exclamation point, I'm just going to guess g6.
Oh, no, g6 doesn't get an exclamation point. So we don't want to touch these pawns. Right now our pawns are solid, and g6, again, just makes more weaknesses. If a rook ever lands on the 6th rank, it's able to attack all the pawns.
No one would consider.
Well, you're not wrong. You're not wrong, but, Rubinstein considered it, obviously. So I'll just go ahead and tell you. Well, I won't tell you, but I'll show you what the sort of the line of thinking, at least what I think the line of thinking was. So everybody wants to play rook e8. Looks good, right? We're activating the rook. It's better than rook h8 because rook h8 doesn't really come with a threat. So we're activating the rook. We're threatening rook e2, trying to pick up the f pawn. We're also threatening rook e4, trying to pick up the d pawn. So now what I think the idea was here is white plays king d2, rook e4, and then white plays a4 and is able to sort of distract the black king away directly. So somebody got the bright idea to say, but if it were white to move in this position, then perhaps white would not have any useful moves, and black could get something similar with the rook still, back here, out in front of the pawns. So we could, maybe force something like, let's just say it was white's move. I'm going to triangulate very clumsily. White to move here. And let's say maybe white has to play some losing move like a4. Then we can just come right back in front of the pawn and pick it up for free without committing to rook e4 or anything. Now I think that was the line of thinking, which is why in this position, Rubinstein was aiming to get this rook e8 position with the king on d2. Now how does he achieve that? Just plays rook a7. And all the annotators lose their minds. Rook a7, what a concept. Passing the move back to white. And now after king d2, we get rook e7, achieving our goal. But the problem here is that white is able to play a move that is perhaps more useful than Rubinstein or the annotators bargained for. So white to move here. And Spielmann actually finds it in the game. And the YouTube chat is asking some very important questions, which is, again, who calculated rook e3? Like, we're skipping over a lot of all the difficult calculations. But rook e3, that's what endgames are about. Whoever can calculate it correctly. So I'll be impressed if you guys come up with this move.
It's like the best move for white.
Yeah, best move for white here, and it's actually, I don't know if it's the only move that keeps him in the game, but certainly a very, very important idea. All right, and just to satisfy the chats, let's look at what happens on rook e3. Of course, black thought of this move and would play rook takes e3. And it turns out that this endgame is going to be good for black if we take with the pawn. Now, I didn't prep this endgame specifically, so I'm going on the fly here. So if you see something wrong, tell me. But I think f5 is going to be quite good. f5 stops any idea of e4, making a passed pawn. And if we try to come over here, we can just go f4. Take, take, take. And these pawns actually defend each other due to king and pawn trickery. For example, here. And white cannot capture the pawn. Otherwise, the other pawn will queen. So king and pawn endgame looks good for black. If we take with the king, this king and pawn endgame also looks good for black. There's not too much going on here, I think. I guess you have to calculate a little bit, but I think this is going to be simple enough. Any ideas like this are just way, way, way too slow. Not a chance. Not a chance. So rook e3 is no good. Doesn't get the job done. And that's why it's important to calculate. All right, any ideas? Doesn't matter if you don't have the details worked out, but okay, f3. F3 is not going to be it. I think in this instance, now we can actually switch our ideas and start going after the h pawn. It's not so good to block off the rook's access to that guy. Yeah, and here I think you just have too many problems. So to highlight the other important line to calculate, king c2 seems to be the only passing move that white has. This is why the annotators thought Rubinstein was such a genius because white doesn't have a good move that passes. If you play king c2, of course, we're going to go rook e2. And again, after much calculation, you see that this king and pawn endgame is also winning for black. So king c2 doesn't get the job done. That means white can no longer pass, can no longer hold his little fortress here, which is why the Zugzwang at first was thought to be such a great idea. And the chat room has a good idea. Rook c3 check. So the time is finally right for white to just give up this d-pawn and start going for active play. So rook c3 check was played in the game, and now all of a sudden we're getting a4. We're able to activate our queenside pawn finally. I'm going to put the rook behind it and give white something to think, or give black something to think about on the side of the board. Rook c3 check was needed, by the way, because if you play a4 right away, my king is here in time to catch the pawn. Oh, I'm sorry, rook a7 as well. This was the idea that I mentioned. Versus in this position, I play rook a7, play rook a3, and it's going to be a lot different. Okay, so rook c3 check is the big idea, which is why my bold claim here, I'm going against decades of thinking in the chess world, and so much so that I tried to do some research, see if anybody annotated this game recently to point out this move. But I think rook e8 is just winning. And we'll see that in the line played in the game, maybe black is no longer winning. So rook e8, and what's the point? Well, the point is now we are threatening rook e2. So white is not in Zugzwang, but does have to respond to this. This makes king to d2 the only move. If you try to do something similar with check and a4, now it's just not going to work out for you. I get rook e2, I get to take your pawns, and you're in a lot of trouble here. Doesn't matter if the e pawn is rolling, because I'm up so many pawns on the king's side. So you have to go king d2, and now rook e4. And it's just very, very direct. You have to try for this a4 plan still. By the way, this is still not good for black. So we go king b4, as planned. But the problem now is that at the end of the day, we have some ideas, and I computer checked all of this. I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but at the end of the day, we're going to end up with something like this, okay? Something like this. Just trust me, all the lines end up in some version of this. This is about as good as I can make it for white. And here, black has a winning idea. So I want to see if you guys know your theory, know your endgame theory here. So what is black aiming for in this position to make it winning? Well, yeah, if only it were so simple. Right now, both of white's pawns are well defended. So I guess that's the question. Are we going after this guy? Are we going after this guy? What can we do?
Could you push one of your pawns? G-pawn?
Okay, we could push g4, but what's going on in that position?
I mean, then you can either take or push, and either way that you have passed pawns, two of them.
Okay. So g4 is a very, very important idea. It's almost the right idea, but we can do a slightly improved version of it. Not quite. So here, I want to remove some of the mystery here. Let me tell you the position we're aiming for. So if the g pawn and the h pawn disappear from the board, everything else is as it is. Two connected passed pawns are always going to be winning against the one passed pawn on a5. So that's the theoretical knowledge that I was digging for. Now, if you just know that, then that's great, because now you can calculate and figure out how you can force that position. So black can force that position here.
Could it be like rook to h4 or something?
Yeah, it's exactly right. Rook h4, king f2, trying to come defend. And now g4. Yeah, we get takes, takes. And to prove it, table base says black is winning. Says this is a losing position for white. I don't know if you guys have ever used table bases before, but this is what it looks like when it's a win. The little block here is colored black. So that's why I think that this rook e8 move is just winning the game. And again, you know, if you see my notation here, I got pretty in depth with analyzing this position, but this is sort of the main variation here that black has to keep track of. And by the way, why is g4 not good? Well, I think it's this move h4. I'm going to cheat though, because no, it's okay. So h4 is still no good because we can go g6 and we still get connected past pawns. But the move rook g3 is going to be good enough. And after g takes h3, we can take the g pawn rather than the h pawn. And now my friend over here says that the game is a draw. So rook g3 is the critical move that we're looking out for. Again, we don't really care about this guy. The story is all about what's happening over here on the king side. So that's why I think, you know, annotators throughout the decades were all wrong. Rook a7, it's a nice idea, trying to put white into Zugzwang here, but in the end, sometimes it's better just to play with the tempi. By the way, there's one more critical line I want to show here. a4 is really the only idea for white to try to escape. But now after rook d4, rook d3, rook f4, king e3, rook f5, rook d4 check, king c5. Again, this is all more or less the only main variation here. Now, in the previous line I showed, I played rook d3 for white. The idea is to help keep everything defended, and I played this d4 tactic for black to overwork this white king between the two rooks. But white could also theoretically try rook to d1 here, and now after d4 play king e2, and white might be holding in this position. But black has an improvement with rook f4. And now the problem is black can go after basically all of the remaining pawns. For example, rook c1, king d6, rook a1, rook h4, and now with the h pawn falling, we're going to end up with something very, very similar. Where at the end of the day, well, here, for example, rook takes a7, and it's going to be winning, I think? I don't know. Hold on. I might have gotten my lines confused here. Might have gotten my lines confused. Let's check. Let's check. Yeah, king d4, king b6, takes, takes. And I believe this endgame is also winning. Because again, okay, yeah, this is pretty clear. Again, we're coming in with rook f4. And we're getting a very, very similar endgame here, where black is going to be able to get connected past pawns and win. For example, rook b3, again g4, and again connected past pawns, and again it's winning. So if you don't believe me, look for yourself. I analyzed this for quite a while, and I think rook e8 just wins. But anyways, rook a7, exclam, puts white into Zugzwang. So we see rook c3 check. Now king takes on d4. And a4. Again, with the same idea, we want to activate our rook and basically activate our pawn. Use our pawn as a decoy so we can have enough counterplay to draw the game. We get rook a7, rook a3. And then again, black to move here. See if you can come up with another important resource. Another important move. Maybe. It's one of the pieces that's left. So that's definitely, we can go king c4 or something is what you're thinking about, I guess? Yeah, so king c4 is one idea, but I think, again, we're just going to be pushing this guy. And it's a lot of calculating to do, but again, I think white is just close enough to the king side here. Your king's a little bit too boxed out for you to be able to go for this.
I narrowed it down to 15 moves.
Okay, Brian counted all the legal moves in the position. Let's see if he's right. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 legal moves. All right, the math checks out. Yeah. The math checks out.
Wouldn't it be rook on a5 just to stop the pawn?
Yeah, that's exactly right. This is probably a similar feeling to when we looked at rook a8. Again, rook a8 was the correct in one of the initial positions I showed, because we could go rook a4, stopping the a pawn in its tracks so that white can't get that active play. And the idea is the same here. We want to go rook a5, stop this pawn on a4 before it becomes a problem for us, before we need to divert all of our pieces back and end up in those endgames that aren't winning for black. So rook a5 is a great start. We get rook back to a1 now. Let me just check where we are. Okay, so now black has obviously made quite a bit of progress since we started. That progress comes in the form of having an extra d pawn. So it's pretty intuitive. What's black's idea to follow? Yeah, push the pawn forward. So that's what Rubinstein does. He goes king c4, king to e3, and d4 check. Okay, king back to d2. And now it's getting a little bit tougher to make more progress with the d pawn. So again, we have to find some way to remaneuver our pieces. And one more time, let me make sure critical idea is here. Okay, we are at the critical moment. So again, now we're getting almost an exact repetition of the ideas that I was talking about when white still had a d pawn on the board. All of those principles are coming into play again. So if you, sorry, go ahead. Oh yeah, I can't really see. It's tough.
Well, like the only thing that I can imagine is to like go for the f pawn, but it's like, do you still want to keep that rook in front of that a pawn?
Yeah. So if you remember, when we first started in this endgame, we played rook a8 and then rook a4, and then eventually we came through with this critical idea, king c4. And king c4 was so important because it freed up our rook. We used our king to blockade the a pawn, to use our rook to make threats on the other side of the board. Because the rook's more powerful. It's a more powerful piece than the king. It's better at attacking pawns than the king. So the same goes for this position. We want to do this changing of the guard again. We used our rook to stop the pawn immediately, and now we want to use our king instead to help stop the pawn. So it's just a question of what's the most accurate way to do that. We're on c4.
Or not c4, I mean b4.
Yeah, so king b4 is the critical point to stop the pawn. But it turns out most accurate is to go rook f5 first. We gain a tempo on this guy, so you don't have time to push. Then after king e1, now king b4. And this is the point for black. We're using our king to stop the a pawn, to free up our rook, to make threats on the other side of the board. And from here, if I'm not mistaken, I think white is just close to busted. So king e2, and what's the continuation of our idea now? Yeah, just king a5. We transpose the rook and the king. Put the king in front of the pawn. to free up our rook to make threats. Now rook to a3. And again, our job is not so simple. So again, we just want to improve our rook now to make more threats. So as we're kind of cutting it close on time here, I'll just show some moves. So rook f4, rook a2, rook h4. We bring our rook to h4, defends our d pawn, pressures the important h pawn. Now here, white just goes king d3. And I think this is a pretty critical mistake because it allows black to take on h3. And we're going to end up in this endgame here, which is, once again, going to be busted for white. The 3 versus 1 here is not so easy to draw. And we'll get into that in a moment. But of course, what do you think would be a better way for black to try to hold on here?
For black to hold on?
I'm white to hold on.
It wouldn't be to move the king right there. It'd be to probably move your rook to protect the pawn.
Yeah, you can try rook a3, but what's the problem with this move?
And the king attacks the rook.
Yeah, the king attacks the rook, so we need to move this guy. Where do you want to move him to?
I mean, I guess that means it's not the right move, right?
Well, no. I mean, this is, I think, the best idea for white at this point.
D5 or D3.
Okay, d3, but now I can take your pawn, and then my king is free to join the party. So I think instead, white should head back to a1, give up the h pawn. But now, of course, our big improvement is that the king is no longer out in front of the pawn. And we have ideas like this once again. We have to blockade it. And then while your king comes over here, I should be able to come in with my king. And I think actually this endgame might also be losing, but I think that this is the best that white could go for at this moment. I think that the damage is sort of already done here. So that's why white goes king d3 instead, but this endgame is also not so good. Just to show the technique, Spielmann now goes with rook e2. Rook f4 is very, very active. And again, black's goal here is to just get those two connected pass pawns. So king e3, we bring the king back into play. White tries to cut the king off. But now, after rook a4, I think the idea here was just to bring the king in with rook a6 to c6. So white tries to go after the pawns on the king side instead, allowing the king back in. But g6 is the critical move here. If white does not go for this blockade, we're just going to go king e6 and win the game. Check king f5, for example, or check g6, king f5, for example. Black keeps all the pawns, can play g4 and get that winning position. Just to show it's kind of hard to even play moves here, but yeah, let's say something like this, g6. We want to stop the checks. And this should be pretty easy for black to win. We're going to go with g4 and win the game. So instead, king f5, this allows g6. And this pawn endgame is winning after g4. You can come over here. But again, let me make sure I'm not messing anything up. I think just king f4, and you have too many problems here. Too many problems. And so Rubinstein is winning the game. So now the question becomes, well, where did white go so wrong? And I think that happens back here somewhere. So yeah, I think this move king d2 is the big mistake here for white. And I'm not going to try to solve it right here, but I thought that king e4 might be a better try. No, I'm wrong. So king d2 is correct. Rook f5, king e1. But here, yes, here I think white needs to try to get active once again. We need to come out with our rook and get active a little bit earlier. Which is why black ended up losing after rook a3, because this rook h4 idea is just too strong. It's just too strong. And the engine again says that this is actually the best idea for whites. My impression was that this endgame should be losing anyways. And yeah, my impression was correct. So here, Rook c1, and white could have tried to get active earlier on, and that would be the way to save the game. Which is why all those moves ago, rook a7, big mistake, big mistake. And chess authors of history are in shambles. Also back here, rook c1 a little bit earlier is also good enough, I think. Can come in and get active with the rook. And so this is the problem for black. This is why black is not just directly winning. Okay, so let's review, and then I'll open it up to some questions. So we started in this position, and we said black should be better because white has all these pawn islands. Rook takes c2 is necessary, otherwise white's going to get very active with something like rook d7. So we trade the rooks, and then we immediately go with rook a8. And this move is better than the alternative rook b3 or king e7, because we need to stop white's a pawn on a3. We don't want to let this pawn advance after something like rook a2 and the pawn goes forward. So we use our rook to blockade the pawn. Now what happens next? Well, of course, we bring the king in, and then our big improving idea. First, we fix the structure on the king side, make it super solid. Then we bring our king into c4. Why is bringing the king into c4 so important? Because we want to stop the a pawn with our king to free up our rook. So we change out the rook for the king as far as guarding the pawn goes, stopping the pawn from advancing. This allows us to make threats in the center of the board and on the king side using the rook, threats like rook e4. So white then has to give up the d pawn. In exchange for the d pawn, white gets to push the pawn one more square. So again, now we get a repetition of the ideas. We use our rook to stop the pawn. What's next? We swap out the rook for the king. We play rook f5 and bring our king to a5 to stop the pawn. And then finally, we see white buckling under the pressure with this rook coming through and winning on the king's side. And as they say, the rest is technique. Easier said than done sometimes. But this position is winning with the active rook on f4 and the king coming back to the center of the board. So a couple really important endgame ideas here. I can't stress enough how important this move, rook a8, is in this position. This is really the only practical try. Otherwise, rook a2, and the pawn starts getting pushed. And every square that pawn gets becomes a bigger and bigger problem for black. So really nice repetition of ideas. Blockading with the rook, switching the rook out for the king, and then doing it all over again in order to win the game. So any questions on this endgame? I know we just spent an hour on the one endgame, but it was kind of worth it, I think. There was a lot going on here. So any questions for me? Julian.
In your line with king d2, what was black doing against rook e3?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
So,
Line with king d2
no. So,
before this?
So, sorry, you said it was rook e8, right?
Yeah.
Rook e8, and you said white should play king d2 here, right?
Yeah.
But I was thinking rook e3.
Ah, no, big mistake. Big mistake. We analyzed this endgame.
This one?
Yeah. You can't play a4, because then I just take it. And if you come back this way, again, if you play a4, I can now take your d pawn. OK, and yeah, g5, I guess, might be somewhat important here, so you don't have to calculate anything. But if you're any slower, then my pawns just defend themselves with something like this. We saw a different version where black was able to do this. But yeah, rook e3, you just take it, and the king and pawn endgame is winning in this line as well. OK, any other questions? OK, Great Wolf in the chat says, when black plays rook f5, could white just give the f pawn for a5, same as one of those later lines? So I think you're talking about this position. Can you just play a5? And yeah, the difference here is that you are getting your pawn to be super far advanced. I'm just in time to stop it. But the difference here is that I have 3 pawns on the other side of the board rather than similar positions without this e pawn or d pawn on the board. The d pawn makes a big difference. Because here, I don't necessarily have to come back with my king. I can just start pushing my other pawns as well. For example, how do I want to do this? Let's say I play king d5 and check, for example. I'm going to give up this pawn, just come take this guy, and I can push on this side of the board. Good question, though. Good question. Okay, anything else before we call tonight? All right. So with that, the Rook Endgame god, Akiba Rubinstein, wins against Spielmann. And we didn't even get to look at the other endgame I wanted to go over, but that's okay. So as always, I want to thank you guys so much for joining me here on YouTube and in person. Next week, this class will be taught by Grandmaster Alex Yermolinsky. He's coming in as our next Grandmaster in Residence, so don't miss that one. I'm super excited to have Uncle Yermo here with us. I think it's going to be a lot of good chess content. So as always, my name is Caleb Denby. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.